EVO. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a room when everyone present understands something without needing to say it out loud. It's not the silence of uncertainty or confusion or hesitation. It's something more deliberate than that. It's a quiet alignment, an unspoken recognition that a decision has already been made, even if its language has yet to be formalized. In the early decades of the 20th century, as electric light moved from novelty to necessity, rooms like this began to appear with increasing frequency. Not public spaces, not places designed for spectacle or announcement, but private environments where the future of an industry could be discussed without interruption. Tables polished smooth from use, papers arranged with care, conversations carried in measured tones that suggested control rather than urgency. And within those rooms, a realization had begun to take hold. It wasn't dramatic, and it didn't arrive as a revelation. It emerged slowly as the natural consequence of success. The world had been illuminated. Homes, factories, streets, spaces that had once depended on the sun now existed independently of it. The demand that had once driven rapid expansion had begun to stabilize. And with that stabilization came something unexpected. Simply, the product worked too well. Light bulbs that lasted not for months, but for years. Systems that once installed required little to no intervention. A market that, having been filled, no longer demanded constant replenishment. Now, at first, this was seen as a triumph. But over time, it began to resemble something else. A ceiling. And once that perception took hold, the conversation shifted. Not how to improve the product, but how to sustain the system that produced it. And in that shift, quiet and almost imperceptible, the conditions for agreement were established. Welcome back to The Devil Within. You're listening to What We Built and What We Buried, Episode 2, The Agreement. In the last episode, we followed a single object, a light bulb that refused to fail, and allowed it to raise a question that felt simple at first, but grew more complex the longer we sat with it. If durability was once possible, why is it no longer expected? So tonight we move beyond the question. We step into the moment where that question was answered. Before we go further, please take a moment and make sure you're following The Devil Within wherever you're listening right now or on the EVO Creative YouTube channel, because this is where the story stops being theoretical and starts becoming something that you'll recognize everywhere. There's a tension in the writing of Ralph Waldo Emerson between self-reliance and conformity, between the idea that systems are built by individuals and the quieter truth that individuals over time begin to align themselves with the systems that they inhabit. It's a tension that feels distant when considered in the abstract, but immediate when observed in practice. Because what we are about to explore is not simply a decision made by a bunch of corporate executives. It's a moment in which alignment replaced resistance. This is Chapter 4, The Conditions for Agreement. By the early 1920s, the electric light industry had reached a stage that few of its original architects could have fully anticipated. What had begun as a race to establish infrastructure had matured into something far more complex. The rapid expansion that defined the late 19th and early 20th centuries had slowed, not because the technology had reached its limits, but because it had achieved its purpose. Homes had been wired, cities had been illuminated. The novelty of the electric light had given way to expectation, and with that expectation came a subtle but significant shift in the nature of demand. Growth began to stabilize. For the companies that produced light bulbs, the stabilization introduced a problem that wasn't immediately visible, but increasingly difficult to ignore. Sales data, which had once reflected steady expansion, started to plateau. Replacement cycles stretched longer than anticipated. Products designed for durability were performing exactly as intended, and in doing so, They were reducing the frequency with which consumers needed to return to the market. It was, in a very real sense, a paradox of success. The better the product, the less often it was needed. And for an industry built on production, this posed a question that could not be resolved through engineering alone. Because the issue was not how to make the bulb function. It was how to ensure that it remained part of an ongoing system of exchange. Within boardrooms across Europe and the United States, this question began to take shape, not as a crisis, but as a persistent concern. Executives examined reports, they compared regional performance, noted the same pattern emerging across different markets. The initial surge of electrification had passed. What remained was maintenance, a much slower and more predictable form of demand that didn't align with the structures that had been built to support such rapid growth. And at first, the response was cautious. Adjust production levels, explore new markets, introduce variations in design that might encourage replacement. These were incremental strategies, attempts to align output with the changing environment without fundamentally altering the nature of the product itself. But over time, it became clear that these measures were simply insufficient. The problem was not external. The problem was inherent. A product that lasted too long would always undermine the system that depended on its replacement. And once that realization was fully understood and ingested, that's when the conversation actually changed. It moved away from the language of innovation and toward the language of coordination. Because if one company chose to reduce the lifespan of its bulbs while others continued to produce longer-lasting versions, it would place itself at a disadvantage. Consumers, given the choice, would gravitate toward durability. The market would reward the company that resisted the change, and any attempt to alter the standard would collapse under the pressure of competition. Unless the standard itself could be agreed upon. Now, this is the point at which the idea of alignment begins to take form, not as an abstract principle, but as a practical solution to a shared problem. If all major manufacturers operated under the same assumptions, if they produced bulbs with similar lifespans, similar performance characteristics, similar expectations, then the competitive advantage of durability would simply disappear. The market would stabilize around a new definition of normal, one in which replacement was not an occasional necessity, but a predictable part of ownership. It's important to understand that this didn't feel in the moment like any kind of violation of progress. It felt like management. It felt like the responsible thing to do, like the necessary evolution of an industry adapting to its own success. And within that framework, the groundwork was laid for what would come next. Not necessarily a conspiracy or a secret, but an agreement. An agreement by a consortium of companies that happened to have the word cartel in their name. Also one that would redefine not just a product, but the expectations that surround it. Chapter 5. The Terms of Control. When this agreement finally took shape, it did so with the quiet confidence of something that no longer needed to justify itself. By the mid-1920s, the conversations that had begun as cautious examinations of market behavior had matured into coordinated action. Representatives from the most influential light bulb manufacturers, companies whose reach extended across Europe and into the United States, came together not to speculate, but to formalize what had already become clear. The organization that emerged from those meetings would come to be known, as we know, as the Phoebus cartel. Its stated purpose was measured, almost mundane, simply standardization. Efficiency and stability, but standardization. And the language of the agreement reflected the priorities of an industry seeking to regulate itself in the absence of external constraint. Production quotas would be discussed. Markets would be aligned. Technical specs would be shared to ensure consistency across regions that had once operated independently. Kind of like the 5 families in New York, dividing the territories, figuring out what the prostitution rates were, what the VIGs were, what the cocaine purity on the street was going to be. Normal business stuff. On the surface, it was the kind of coordination that often accompanies maturity. But beneath the surface, something more precise was being established. Because within the framework of standardization, one metric carried particular weight: lifespan. The decision, when it was introduced, didn't arrive as a restriction. It was framed as a target, a carefully considered balance between performance and practicality. A light bulb, it was agreed, should last approximately 1,000 hours. Not the maximum that could be achieved, but the optimal point at which efficiency, brightness, and replacement aligned in a way that sustained both the product and the system that produced it. It was a definition, not a limitation. At least that's how it was presented. Now, be honest, because I only learned this when I was researching this episode. I always thought that seeing 1,000 hours meant like, whoa, this one gets to 1,000 hours. Maybe these other ones don't. And that's what it was designed, to trick us. To see 1,000 hours on something makes you think, wow, this is the best one out there. Because a standard's only meaningful if it's maintained. And maintaining it required something more than agreement. It required enforcement. This is where the character of the arrangement begins to change. And not abruptly or in a way that announced itself as coercion, but through the introduction of mechanisms designed to ensure compliance. Testing protocols were established, not just to confirm performance, but to measure adherence to the agreed-upon lifespan. Samples of bulbs, were collected and evaluated under controlled conditions. Their hours of operation recorded with a precision that reflected the importance of the metric being monitored. And when those measurements exceeded the standard, in other words, when a bulb lasted too long, it was no longer considered a success. That was the deviation, and it was thrown out. Companies whose products exceeded the 1,000-hour target were subject to penalties. Fines were imposed, calculated not on failure, but on endurance. The logic was clear. A bulb that outlasted the standard disrupted the balance that this cartel sought to maintain. It introduced variability into a system that depended on predictability. And predictability, more than durability, had become the measure of success. It's difficult to overstate the significance of this shift because it represents a moment in which excellence, as it had once been defined, was reclassified as error, as deviation. A bulb that burned longer than expected was no longer an achievement. It was a problem to be corrected. And so, correction became the objective. Designs were then adjusted. Filaments were refined not to extend lifespan, but to contain it. Materials that had once been chosen for their resilience were reconsidered in light of their compliance with the standard. Engineers who had once been tasked with pushing the limits of endurance now found themselves working within boundaries that were explicitly defined. This wasn't exactly the abandonment of innovation. It kind of was, but it was more of a redirection. Because innovation didn't stop. It just moved. Efficiency improved. Production methods became more sophisticated. Distribution networks expanded. But the one dimension that had once defined the product, its ability to endure, was no longer a variable to be maximized. It was a constraint to be managed. And within that constraint, the system stabilized. What do you know? Consumers, you and me, when we encountered bulbs that performed consistently but within a predictable range, we adapted without resistance. Replacement just became routine. The act of purchasing a new bulb was no longer tied to unexpected failure, but to an anticipated interval. The market, once driven by extremes of durability, just settled into a rhythm that felt natural precisely because it was controlled. The agreement had done what it was intended to do. It had aligned the industry. It had stabilized demand. It had transformed a product that once challenged the limits of endurance into one that reinforced the expectations of a system. And in doing so, it established a model, one that extends far beyond light bulbs, beyond the specific conditions of the early 20th century, into a broader understanding of how products could be designed, not simply to function, but to participate in an ongoing cycle. A cycle in which success was no longer defined by how long something could last, but by how reliably it could be replaced. Chapter 6, the pattern that followed. So once these terms were set and the standard enforced, the agreement didn't need to announce itself again. It just continued, embedded in the design choices that followed, carried forward by engineers who inherited its assumptions, and by markets that adapted to its rhythms without ever needing to name them. The light bulb didn't become worse in any obvious sense. It still lit up rooms. It still fulfilled its purpose. It still appeared to anyone not looking too closely to be a product of progress. But the nature of that progress had shifted. It no longer aimed toward endurance as an open horizon. It operated within boundaries that had already been defined. And what began with a single product didn't stay contained. Because the logic that shaped the bulb, this careful balance between performance and replacement, that proved to be scalable, transferable. It could be applied to anything that existed within a system of production and consumption. Appliances, machinery, eventually electronics, each category different in form but similar in structure, each one subject to the same quiet question. Not how long can it last, but how long should it last? This is how patterns take hold, not through declaration, but through repetition. A decision made once becomes a precedent becomes a model, and over time, that model becomes indistinguishable from the natural order of things. Consumers adjust without noticing. Expectations shift without resistance. The failure of an object becomes less of an event and more of a routine, something anticipated, even planned for. Warranties are structured around this. Replacement cycles are built into ownership. The idea of permanence begins to feel really impractical or even unnecessary. And somewhere in that transition, the original possibility, the idea that things could be built to endure far beyond their immediate use, that just recedes into the background, remembered only when something like the Livermore light bulb interrupts the narrative. The devil within this story is not the agreement itself, it's what the agreement made possible. Because once failure becomes a feature, once it's designed into the structure of a product, it reshapes not only how things are made, but how they're perceived. It redefines value. It alters the relationship between maker and user, and it does so without ever requiring acknowledgement. The system continues, and the pattern persists. So there's a tendency to look at something like the Livermore bulb and treat it as an anomaly, a relic of a different time that holds little relevance for the present. It's easier, maybe, to see it as a curiosity than as a point of comparison. Easier to admire its endurance than to question the absence of that endurance anywhere else. But its persistence invites a different kind of reflection. Not on what has been lost, but on what has been redefined. We like to believe that the limits we encounter are the result of necessity, that the lifespan of the objects around us reflects the best that can be achieved within the constraints of material and design and human ingenuity. But the history of the light bulb suggests something far different and much more complicated. It suggests that those limits are, at least in part, chosen. And not chosen in isolation or through a single act of decision, but through a series of adjustments that align products with systems and that prioritize continuity over endurance, that shape the world not according to what's possible, but according to what is sustainable. And once those choices are made, they become very difficult to see. They just settle into the background, into quiet assumptions that govern how we live, how we consume, and how we replace. Until something remains long enough to remind us that at one time, long ago, it was actually a choice. Thanks for listening to The Devil Within, What We Built and What We Buried. We'll see you next week. The Devil Within is an EVO production recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. For The Devil Within, I'm your writer and host, Brandon Morgan.